Chapter 30. Gregory tossed and turned in his bed in the early morning hours, thinking he might be able to get comfortable if only he could find some hitherto undiscovered third side of himself that he could lie down on. He had felt that he needed to sleep, even if for the ever shorter time that his body would still allow it. But his mind was restless. He always enjoyed his visits with Vivian, but then he went home, where he would remind himself that the pain was inevitably coming. Perhaps his error the last time around was that he had forgotten to stay unhappy, and then he had gotten his hopes up. And even if straight-out disaster did not befall them again, Gregory knew better than anyone how time could fly. Things would be like this with Vivian until they weren't anymore. He began bracing himself for misery. He was also beginning to understand that, for them to go deeper into intimacy, he would have to shed some of his protections and divulge some of his secrets, letting himself become uncomfortable in front of her and taking her inside to places within himself that he never shared with anyone. If he failed to do so, even if it was motivated by prudence, then they could never go any deeper into their mutual knowing of each other. But the thought of telling her even some of his secrets filled him with terror. For a wild moment, he considered running away and leaving her. But of course, he could not do that. He would just have to dig within himself until he found the necessary courage to forge ahead. Complicating things further, he now sensed that he needed to do this quickly. After all, how much longer could he keep Vivian's curiosity about his past at bay? As it was, he had miraculously managed to hold out for years. And if he told her about himself, what would happen? What if this stalling for time had given him the only time that he would still have with her? What if everything would break under the weight of the truth? His was a credulity-straining story. It would be awkward to try to tell it while still holding up certain uncrossable barriers, protecting yet other secrets. And even more than that, it might reveal to her the one thing that Gregory feared more than anything else, that he might not really be a very good man or have much value in this world. A shadow, a ghost, a walking sculpture from the past. What good purpose could such a creature still hope to fulfill? Then all of the well-combed hair and suits and theater tickets and polite mannerisms and small gifts would suddenly be burned away, and the emotionally leprosy-ridden figure behind them would become painfully exposed. Vivian, in contrast, was a truly young and perfect creature. Why should she have to accept anything as flawed as Gregory up close, with his unreasonably long past and his myriad of failures and personal injuries? And then he had a breakthrough of an idea. If he could not be perfect, at least he could be generous, he suddenly thought. On a whim, he decided to go and see his attorney in the morning and tell him to rent or, if at all possible, to outright buy the larger apartment in Vivian's apartment building. When did the attorney's office open? Maybe it was time to get up and get ready? Gregory reached for his pocket watch. It was not yet 4:30 in the morning. He could get up and write for a bit, and then he could go and wait for the attorney's office to open. The memory came to his mind of waiting once for a certain jeweler's shop to open, so that, in desperation, he could rush in and buy the first diamond ring he saw. I have always been thus with you, my love, he thought. Impatient, reckless, worshipping, generous, and afraid of your rejection. The engagement ring had not proven to be a good idea. Hopefully, a new apartment would be a better one. It was certainly more likely that a woman might want a larger living space, rather than that she might want to tie Gregory about her neck like the proverbial millstone. No, she would accept this gift, and it would be a great thing. But what would she put in it? She did not have enough furniture to fill 2 apartments, and assuming that she would leave the smaller apartment to her mother would need those furnishings. If I'm going to do this, I will need to furnish it for her, he realized. This was going to be more complex than just sending out his attorney to buy the place. Gregory would have to visit it himself and see how the rooms were laid out. He also had the presence of mind to realize that the furnishing of apartments was probably beyond his skill, and that he would have to bring along Wolf. May as well go and tell him of all this now, thought Gregory, before I change my mind. And he got up out of bed and went to fill up the bath. By the time he reached Wolf's place, bright morning sunlight filled the city, and Gregory's head was abuzz with ideas for what he would want to put into Vivian's new apartment. At first, he had impulsively thought that he should give her the best of everything, from framed paintings to French porcelain, but then he realized that she would hardly feel at home among so many rare and breakable items, and it had been some work to even get her to accept the gift of a theater dress. No, best to fill her apartment like a successful claims specialist might do, so that the ostentation of giving her an entire apartment for her use might be obscured rather than emphasized. He knew she liked plants, so maybe a plant stand? He knew she liked her old armchair, so maybe that should get reupholstered? Whimsical ideas for Sophie came easily to mind. Oh, if he could only give them this kind of happiness. Nothing else would matter then. Even if Vivian threw him out of her life after this, it would have been worth it to have known her again, just so that he could give them this gift. They could always sell it all and use the money from it for something else in future, but he would have been able to at least contribute to providing for them, even if for just a short time. Gregor, sighed Wolf, pacing about his living room. You are a noble and wonderful spirit. You are generous and kind. You are also, once more, possibly setting yourself up for a painful disaster. What if she does not accept your gift? What will you do with a fully furnished apartment, including a child's bedroom? Would it not be wiser to speak to Fräulein Vivian first, and see if this is the kind of gift she would even accept? She would never accept it unless it was already done, said Gregory. And as for the apartment and its contents, surely it could be sold again if needed? Wolf shook his head and moved his bushy gray eyebrows expressively skyward. It could be sold, yes. But what about your heart? You will feel terrible if she says no to you and refuses this gift. Swear to me that you will not force this gift on her, and that you will remain calm and reasonable if she does not want it. So you will help me to furnish it? Asked Gregory. Looking reluctant, Wolf agreed, but Gregory suspected that he was rather looking forward to it, since the decorating of apartments was one of Wolf's special delights. My love, with Wolf in charge, you will have the most beautiful apartment that any claim specialist in this city could hope to have, Gregory thought happily. The adventure was on. The visit to the attorney's office happened that same day, and by the next afternoon, Vivian was the unaware new owner of a 2-bedroom apartment on the 7th floor. Gregory and Wolf were standing in it and taking measurements. The view is not too terrible, said Wolf, looking out of the living room windows and onto the street. I am glad you are at least showing some reasonableness and restraint by not installing her in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, as you know you could. Her friends are here, as is her mother, said Gregory. I really am thinking of kindness to her, not of embarrassing her or flooding her with happiness irrelevant riches. Wolf nodded. I can see how this would be a blessing to someone in Fräulein Vivian's position. Now here, This room will need to be repainted, and all of the windowsills could use fresh paint as well. Along this wall is room for the plant stand you were telling me about, and a sofa could go here, with a smaller sofa there, and her armchair there. And about that armchair, you really should have a reupholsterer come by to collect that as soon as possible, so that it is finished on time. Wolf was moving through the room and taking in all of the opportunities of the space, and Gregory could see he was in his element. If no one else enjoys this whole adventure, at least Wolf will, he thought. I will tell Vivian and her mother on Wednesday evening about the armchair, when I am next due to visit with them, said Gregory. I already have a scheme to put an accidental rip in it. But what are the instructions to the upholsterer? Oh, that is a very good question, said Wolf. I haven't the slightest idea. We need to go to a fabric store. I'm thinking of some kind of nice floral print. Gregory smiled. Now remember, we are trying to decorate this place like Vivian would be able to do if she had, say, an extra year's worth of salary saved up. I know your tastes, like mine, are rather more extravagant. You will have to control yourself. Wolf looked crestfallen. Yes, of course, nothing too extravagant, he agreed in a small voice. But then Gregory had work to do to peel him away from the luxury end of the fabric options at the store. Standing in the store and reviewing bolts of fabric with Wolf and the shop ladies, Gregory thanked fate that Wolf looked like a much older man. But even so, standing with him in such a store and having all of the female bystanders give Gregory fascinated, sad, and regretful looks was awkward. He was glad when they were finished, having decided on a light blue and green floral fabric that was to serve as the armchair's new skin, plus make 4 square pillows. A thin, sheer fabric was chosen to serve as a simple curtain, and a wide ribbon would serve as its edge. We won't have this one sewn for her, explained Wolf. She is a seamstress, and might want to make some of her things herself, he added. The armchair was taken away by the reupholsterer, and they took a trip the next day to buy Vivian's new sofas, so that now her living room was truly underway. Walls were painted by the painters. Gregory took upon himself personally the decoration of her bedroom and Sophie's room, buying them beds and night tables and chests of drawers. He also had responsibility for the kitchen, since Wolf said he did not know the first thing about what should go in there. The salespeople are telling me formica for the kitchen table, Gregory told Wolf, thinking to seek advice. What is formica? Asked Wolf. Oh, never mind, replied Gregory. Gregory's pocket notebook got so full of items related to this complex project that he had to start a new one before the first week was even out. Despite this, there was a mix-up when he placed 2 orders for the same lamps, having somehow completely wiped out his first order in his memory, and he did not discover his error until he came home and found an identical receipt already on the table in his study. The obligatory bookshelf for Sophie filled his heart with happiness as it arrived and was put in its place against the wall by her small bed. Gregory selected new appliances and dishes for the kitchen, finding a china pattern of yellow and green flowers that he thought looked like something that Mrs. Mullins might have chosen for the farmhouse. And then at last he went out to make the purchase he needed for his most special surprise. "What is that?" asked Wolf, pointing to it. It was late in the night, the time when they generally came to see the progress in the apartment, and the time when Gregory thought the chances were the slimmest that Vivian would see them coming into the building. Wolf was now sitting on one of Vivian's 2 new soft gray sofas. Wolf had initially recommended something in light cream, but then Gregory had reminded him that a small child would scamper over these daily with dirty knees and possibly even outdoor shoes. Wolf was pointing at a fairly tall piece of furniture with a cloth draped over it. "It looks like something from a magician's act. What is underneath, I wonder? A Fräulein ready to be sawed in half?" "Well, it would have to be a very small Fräulein," said Gregory. "No, It is a cage." He took off the cloth. Wolf stared. "Fascinating," he said. "Is it for storing small children? In that case you could have saved your money on that second bed." "Very funny, Wolf, but no. It is for a rabbit," said Gregory. "Ah, das hätte ich nicht gedacht, really. I had no idea you would want to keep rabbits here. How provincial of you. Well, what business is it of mine? Here, I will help you move it into the kitchen," said Wolf. "The kitchen?" asked Gregory, puzzled. "Rabbits are kept to be eaten as food, nein?" asked Wolf. Now he looked puzzled. "Well, at least they were back in my day. Who restocks the rabbit cage each week? Will you hire a service?" "Wolf, this rabbit will not be eaten. It will be a pet for Sophie," explained Gregory calmly. "A pet? Rabbits as pets? Is this an invention of yours?" asked Wolf with suspicion. "No, children in this day and age keep rabbits as pets. No one keeps them about the house as food. At least, I don't think so. I already bought the rabbit for this particular cage earlier today," said Gregory. "I was going to take him to my place, but it was quicker just to drop him by the store. I used my key. He is in a small traveling cage just under your counter." Wolf pushed so hard that he broke the pencil he was holding, with which he had been crossing items off of a list he had brought with him. "Are you telling me that there is a rabbit in my store right now?" he gasped. "Yes, his name is General Beauregard, and he seems rather spooked to be in new environs, so please make no loud or startling noises around him," said Gregory. "No loud noises?" gurgled Wolf, like a man still confronting an inabsorbable shock. "Yes, but do not worry. You'll get the hang of it, as they say," Gregory said, chuckling to himself. This prank alone was worth it out of the whole idea, he thought impishly. Then he went to check on the progress in the bedrooms. One more week and the place would be ready, he thought. When it was all done, it had turned out even better than Gregory had imagined it might, and he and Wolf sat together in Vivian's new kitchen, and, on Gregory's suggestion, they uncorked a bottle of champagne. "You do not have to drink it. Let's just toast," said Gregory, and so they did. "The place looks perfect. Thank you so much, Wolf." "Ah, it was nothing," said Wolf, appearing to take the minutest of sips. "It was a pleasure to do this, no difficulty at all. May she and her daughter be happy here. To Fräulein Vivian." "Yes, to Vivian," agreed Gregory, and they clinked glasses again. "It is fun to toast to something, isn't it?" "It is, yes," agreed Wolf. "All of this was enjoyable. Now just get that rabbit out of my store before I have young William make a winter hat out of him." Wolf's eyes crinkled with good humor. Goodness will come from this, Gregory told himself, as he locked the apartment for the last time that night. Real goodness will come from this, has already come from this. Let love and blessing stitch itself into every object in this apartment, so that she may feel surrounded by tenderness and infinite care. The next Sunday afternoon came, and Vivian, Gregory, and Sophie went to the nearby park. The weather was warm and perfect summer. "Aren't you too warm in your dark suit and your dark vest?" Vivian asked him. "Not really," replied Gregory honestly. "I think it is more stylish these days not to wear vests anymore," she told him. "Is that so?" he asked. "I think you would look just fine without a vest," she continued. Where was this coming from? Well, I might think on it," he replied evenly. Then, in part to change the subject, he said, "See those birds over there in the tree? They look like foreign birds, perhaps escaped from an aviary. Can you see them?" Sophie looked and claimed to see an ostrich. Vivian squinted, then shook her head. "No, I cannot really see them," she said. "They must be too far away." Gregory looked at Vivian. "You need glasses," he told her with sudden insight. "Reading all of the small-typed words in those insurance contracts has taken its toll." Vivian blushed. "I may need glasses, but I'm certainly not going to wear them," she said. "As it happens, I do have a pair in my night-table drawer. I'm gathering up the courage to wear them. Maybe one day when I'm old. But I'm not going to look like an old maid now." "Oh, this is foolishness, Vivy. No pair of glasses could make you look like anything other than a goddess," he told her. But he could see that her mind was made up. "So I haven't yet had the chance to tell you, but that ogre in the personnel department must have felt guilty about passing me up for that claims specialist position, because I was notified that a small raise is coming to me," Vivian said, sitting up taller. "See? What did I tell you? Things are turning around," said Gregory. "What will you do with the new money?" "I've been thinking, and Sophie really does need to play more with other children. Miss Carroll's play circle takes place just a few streets away, and if I sent her there for 3 hours twice a week, my mother would get more of a break, and Sophie could make more friends of her own age." "Well, that sounds like a good plan," agreed Gregory. "So, whatever happened with the larger apartment upstairs?" he asked, feigning nonchalant ignorance. "My friend Edith told me that it was rented to someone. She saw the furniture being moved in," sighed Vivian. "It's just as well. I couldn't afford to rent it." "It just so happens," said Gregory, enjoying every delicious moment of this conversation, "that I know the new owner." "What? Who is it?" asked Vivian, surprised. "It's you," he said, looking into her wide eyes and picking up her hand and placing the key into her palm. You're making a jest," she said in disbelief. "No, not at all," he replied. "Gregory, listen to me. You cannot just rent me an apartment," she cried. "Why not?" he asked. "Because it is not allowed. It is not proper. This is what comes of having let you buy me that dress. Now you've gotten altogether carried away," she went on, wringing her hands all the while. "Now, Vivian, I'm all in favor of what is proper, but you cannot let foolish pride stomp over the well-being of 2 other persons. Sophie needs her own space, and your mother does too. Your mother has hardly ever known the luxury of having a place of her own, having always had to share it with you. I have no children on whom to lavish my money, and I don't need to save any of it for future descendants. Giving you and your loved ones this gift is financially a modest outlay for me, yet it fills me with a generous and confident feeling. This is a good thing. This is a blessing. Come, give me your arm, and we will go there now and see if it is suitable for you. By the way," he added, "you look incredibly beautiful, even when you are looking stunned." He smiled. Then he called to Sophie to come back out from under the nearest shrub, and that it was time to go and see something new. They walked back to the apartment building, and Gregory could feel Vivian's excitement growing. And then when they passed their old door and kept climbing higher, Sophie also got excited as to where their destination now might be, since Vivian told her they were not going to visit Angela. They came to the door of the new apartment. Vivian turned to Gregory and gave him a damp-eyed look, and then she turned the key in the lock and opened the door. Afternoon sunlight poured in through the windows. Cut flowers in glasses filled the living room, as Wolf had instructed Gregory to do, wafting a delicate perfume through the air. Vivian stepped inside and stopped. "Oh my God, it's all furnished!" "Gregory," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Do you really mean that this is all for us." "Yes," he said. "Let life bring you something wonderful every now and then. Not everything has to be the result of 5 jobs worked at the same time with exhaustion breaking your body. Take this and be happy." Sophie pushed on into the room and began climbing on everything. "Careful with the flowers, Sophie," Vivian told her, her voice hoarse with emotion. "Who lives here?" asked Sophie. "Ask your mother," said Gregory, coming to stand beside Sophie, who had seated herself in Vivian's reupholstered armchair. "We do, Sophie," whispered Vivian, tears rolling down her cheeks. "We do." Gregory turned his head to hide the tears that threatened to betray the depth of his feelings in this moment. "We do, but I don't see any of my things," said Sophie. She jumped down and ran off into the rest of the apartment. "I can't believe it. I can't believe it," Vivian kept repeating over and over, wiping at her face with the back of her hand and touching the sofas and cushions, looking over into the kitchen, where another riot of flowers sat in a cooking pot on the kitchen table. In his enthusiastic planning, Gregory had forgotten about Wolf's mention of vases. "Oh, a rocking horse for me!" came a small shout, and then, "Mother, come quick, come quick! There's a bunny in here!" shrieked Sophie at the top of her small lungs. So much for no startling noises, thought Gregory. Vivian followed Sophie's voice to Sophie's new room, where General Beauregard was standing terrified in the middle of his cage and looking like he might create a small pile of rabbit output at any second. "You cannot frighten him like this," said Gregory. "He is shy and afraid of loud sounds. Come closer, and I will make introductions." Sophie approached the cage on her tiptoes, tugging nervously on the dirt-covered hem of her summer dress. "Does he have a name?" she whispered loudly in her small child's way. "Yes. Meet General Beauregard, a native Louisianan and Southern hero of the war between the states," said Gregory. Sophie's eyes got even bigger. "You mean he is a bunny hero?" she gasped. "Yes, and now he is going to live here with you, if your mother will allow it, that is," said Gregory. "Oh, please, 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 Mother! We have to keep him!" Sophie shouted. "Shh," said Gregory, placing a finger to his lips. "You would have to be much quieter to live here with him." "Please, please, Mother," whispered Sophie at the top of her whispering voice. "How could I say no?" said Vivian, putting her arms around Sophie. Vivian's tears eventually managed to mostly dry up, at least until they got to her new bedroom, and she burst into tears of joy once more at the sight of it. "Gregory, I am approaching 30, and have never had a room of my own. Never in my entire life," she sobbed. "Oh, it is too much. How wonderful this all is." He held her and let her cry. Then, when she had composed herself again, they walked through all of the rooms once more, just to be sure that it had not been an illusion. He followed her as she walked, feeling euphoric. "I did this thing for you," he thought. "Wolf and I did this for you, so that you might be happy." "Here is the fabric and ribbon for your new curtains," said Gregory, pointing to a basket filled with material and set on the floor over by the smaller sofa. "Who did all of this? Do not take offense, but I somehow doubt that you are the interior decorator behind it all," said Vivian, still wiping at the corner of her incomparably lovely gray-green eyes. "It was Wolf," admitted Gregory. "He is best at these things. I hope you are not disappointed by how it all turned out." "It is so wonderful, I hardly know what to say. Mr. Gerstner will have to come by so that I can thank him myself. I'm so grateful. But now I'm in his debt, and how could I possibly repay it?" she asked. Nonsense, said Gregory. Wolf once asked me to come with him on a trip to Europe, to save some old books, a trip that caused you and me a good deal of suffering in its aftermath. Perhaps we can now consider the pain of that past erased a bit by this kindness from him. Vivian nodded. But what will we do with the old apartment? She asked. You mean your mother's apartment? He asked. You can keep it. I can buy that one too for you if you would like. This one has no rent due on it. It is real estate fully in your name, to do with what you would like, and all utility bills come to me. It also has a telephone line. Well, or at least will have soon. The man from the telephone company said he would be by this week to do the installation. I thought this would not be possible here, but it turns out that a few of the apartments in this building do have a telephone, although it is a shared party line. This way I can call you from Wolf's store and ask if it is a good time to visit. It is always a good time for you to visit, she said, throwing her arms about his neck. Thank you, Gregory. I cannot thank you enough. Then, pulling herself to his suit front, she said quietly, You are my miracle. Gregory helped to carry all of Vivian and Sophie's personal things upstairs, and then their new life was truly underway. Vivian's mother had been horrified at the idea that Gregory had bought Vivian an apartment, but then Vivian reminded her that she would now have the entire old apartment for her exclusive use, and that sealed the deal without further argument. A part of him almost wanted to criticize Madame Prevet for the shameless speed with which she dropped her opposition, but then he reminded himself how poor Vivian and her mother had always been, and how deeply grateful they must feel for a miracle like this occurring in their lives. There were times that others had supported him in his life, after all, like Wolf, or like Ferdinand after the war. Now Gregory was the architect of happiness for someone else, something that he could not recall ever having done before to this extent, and it felt unspeakably rare and wonderful. He wondered if loving was in fact far more valuable than being loved. He sat on the smaller of the two sofas and watched Vivian walking about the place, touching things, caressingly and seemingly lost in a kind of private paradise, although a week had now passed. The plant stand was full of plants that had appeared as if out of nowhere, the largest among them being what Vivian told him was, after he had nearly stabbed himself on its thorns while carrying it up, a lemon tree. Dangerous thorns, and on rare occasions also bitter fruit. In other words, the perfect gift from Chip, she laughed wryly. It seemed to Gregory as she spoke of Chip that she already seemed less injured than she had when she and Gregory had first been reunited that cold day just mere months ago in Central Park. Am I making a difference to her? Gregory wondered. Am I really helping to make her better? It seemed an incredible thought. After Gregory had assured Wolf that Madame Prevet had not seen Wolf often enough to remember exactly what he looked like all those years ago, Wolf agreed to come and make a brief visit so that Vivian and her mother could thank him. At Gregory's suggestion that Wolf did not care much for small children, Sophie was introduced and then whisked away downstairs to have dinner with Robert and his mother. The visit turned into a more pleasant time than Gregory thought it would be, and after Vivian at last completed her profuse thank yous, they spoke much of New Orleans. "It is very unusual and courageous of you to uproot yourself and your business in your advanced age," Madame Prevet told Wolf. "Moving away from the familiar is difficult. I ought to know." "Ah, but Frau Prevet, I have already uprooted and moved many times. This is but a small shift," Wolf said. "I have no living family, and more than anything, I want to see my store continue to succeed, and business after the war was terrible in New Orleans. Gregor told me that he was thinking of moving here, so I took it as a sign that it was time to go." "Well, that is of course important, that you could call on Mr. Morgan to assist you if you ever needed anything," said Madame Prevet, and Gregory thought of how ironic this statement was, given that it was always Gregory who needed the assistance, and Wolf who gave it, that it was Wolf who was the strong one. "It is funny, though," continued Vivian's mother. "I thought Mr. Morgan told us that he moved here because you did." Wolf smiled, unperturbed. "There are doubtless many cities to which I could have moved my book repair store. It would be most accurate to say that both Gregor and I moved here within a few years of each other, because of a certain young lady. Gregor came here hoping to perhaps meet Fräulein Vivian again, and I came to give my bookstore a renewed lease on life. It has all worked out very well, evidently. Do you have any idea how many wealthy collectors of rare and antique books reside in New York and its greater environs? I find I am busier than ever." "Oh, do you think you will ever grow tired of running a shop?" asked Madame Prevet. "Might you perhaps retire one day, after a few more good years?" That I might, said Wolf thoughtfully, as if weighing the options. "Now tell me what I most want to know. How is that rabbit? He lived in my store for a solid week and a half, and I was tempted to start charging him rent." Vivian and her mother both smiled brightly. There was no denying it. General Beauregard was the hit of the summer. Sophie played with him and petted him incessantly, and she eagerly embraced all of the tasks required to care for him. When Gregory came to visit on Wednesday evenings, Madame Prevet would be visiting, clearing up after Sophie's dinner, and Gregory would join an exhausted Vivian on the sofa, and then Sophie would carry out her bunny and set him on Gregory's lap. It had taken a bit of time to get to this level of comfort, since animals as a rule detested and mistrusted Gregory. But Gregory had begun making the acquaintance of Bunny Beauregard even before entrusting him to Sophie's care, and in the end, the bunny sat rather resignedly and stoically on Gregory's lap, while Sophie rattled on and on about her latest adventures with him. Then Vivian's mother would say good night and go to her own apartment downstairs. Sophie would ride her rocking horse one last time for the day, and then Sophie's bedtime routine would start. What followed was always a glorious evening. Gregory hardly even dared to look too closely at it all, lest it should melt. But their new life together was the closest thing to real family life that he had had in an extremely long time. 2 or 3 nights a week, on Wednesdays, and then again on some of the other evenings of the weekend, Gregory would find himself invited to briefly slip into this exotic and irresistible game of playing house with Vivian. Suddenly, the gloomy mood that always eventually gripped him and kept him from wanting to make any lengthier social calls seemed to subside, and he felt happy to come and be with Vivian at every possible occasion, week after week. He would call, she would confirm that they were at home, and then he would come over and knock on the door. Sometimes it was open for him and he just let himself in. Often he opened his notebook and told her about the various things that he had seen or heard or thought of during the time that they had been apart, and that he had written down, lest he forget them. One evening he came in and found her sitting over a plate of food in the kitchen. He greeted her and pulled out a chair to join her. "Are you just going to sit there and watch me eat?" Vivian asked after a while, glowering up at him from beneath her eyelashes. "Sorry, but it's been a long day today," she added. She was eating much better now than she had ever done, and he was grateful for it. She was still a few shades too slender, perhaps, but at least Sophie now had that healthy, full-cheeked cherubic look that Vivian had never had. The insurance company might be staffed by ogres, but at least their money was putting quantities of real and healthy food on this kitchen table. Confidently he smiled over at Vivian and replied, "So what do you propose to do? Are you going to send me away 3 or more times a day instead? Besides, you look beautiful when you eat, when the fork touches your lips and—" His thoughts unraveled as his emotions got louder in his head. She was just too beautiful, under any circumstances, dining or otherwise, he thought. Vivian lowered the wrist of her hand, holding her fork, back down to the table, finished chewing, and then said thoughtfully, Suddenly I don't even want to eat any more." Then she shook her head, as if to clear the faint blush which was creeping up her neck, and then she said, "All right, stay. You are right. I would just have to get used to it." Sophie's bookshelf was filling up quickly, and Sophie surprised him by showing him that she had learned to read some of the words herself. At what age did children learn to read, he wondered. Was this a sign of extraordinary brilliance? He watched her sitting up in bed, her shining blonde head bowed over her book, and her face showing her deep focus as her small finger moved across the pages. "It isn't reading, Gregory," Vivian told him. "It's her memory. Thanks to you, she knows all of those books by heart now." "Ah, how I envy her such a good memory," he laughed. "I'm glad when I remember now where I put the books, never mind remembering what's actually in them." More than once now, he had brought a new book for Sophie, only to discover that she already had it. Well, we all have to learn to get used to something, he thought wryly. Reading with Sophie in the evenings was one of the extreme pleasures of his week. She could hear the same story over and over and never grow tired of it. And like any child, of course she had her particular favorites, which he had to reread to her many, many times. It touched his emotions to be reading to a small child like this, and he doubted he would have believed it a year ago if someone had told him that this is what he would find himself doing one day in the not-too-far-off future. One night, he brought her an adapted small child's version of Hans Christian Andersen's The Little Mermaid, which he remembered from his own library. But then, once the story was underway, reading about the heartbreak of a mermaid trying to live in the world of humans in order to be with her beloved, and then reading about the suffering and deformity she was willing to endure to make their relationship possible, suddenly seemed both above his level as well as Sophie's, and he shut the book. It was getting hard to read anyways, what with the corners of his eyes inexplicably itching and then growing damp. He coughed politely, excused himself, left Sophie sitting up in bed and screaming angrily for him to finish reading to her, and he went to the kitchen to get Vivian. Vivian finished the story while Gregory went to the living room, to the small console along the wall, where behind the hanging curtains he had hidden his bottle of bourbon, and he sat down on the sofa, and poured himself a glass. "Well, that was some temper tantrum," sighed Vivian, when she came to join him, once Sophie had been put to rest for the night. "And I was rudely told that I read not nearly as well as you do. Was the story getting too long for you, waiting to uncork the bourbon?" "Much too long," lied Gregory, sipping his drink, and wondering why it wasn't soothing him like he had hoped it might. The warm scent of Vivian sitting close by was actually more soothing right now. "Remind me to stick to books of 20 pages or fewer," he said, "with at most a single sentence on each page." Changing the subject, Vivian said, "My mother is considering taking on a project, helping to sew costumes and sets for a small amateur theater troupe that just got underway in our parish church, like we used to do with the ballet school back home, and she wants to promise them a day a week that she will work on their items." "Amateur theater troupe? Does that mean there is no money involved?" asked Gregory. "She told them she would take it on only if she was paid, but it will not be much money. I think she's hoping that this turns into additional new business in the parish as a result. The point is, there is no weekday that I can stay home, and Miss Carroll's play circle is only from 9 until noon, so then what to do with Sophie?" mused Vivian. "I could watch her," said Gregory. "As long as we stay away from the Little Mermaid, I should be all right," he thought. "We could go into town and sightsee or have other adventures. When would your mother return home?" "She could be back by 4, I think," said Vivian. "But after everything you've done for us of late, I don't think I could ask you for another thing." "Nonsense," Gregory told her. "I would love to do it. By the way, how is Sophie doing in the play circle?" Vivian glowered at him again from under her eyelashes. "Don't even ask. She runs in wild circles through the room, sings at the top of her lungs, and pulls everyone's hair. Miss Carroll has casually asked me if I would consider taking Sophie's schedule down from 3 days a week in the play circle to 2. "Ah, that's my girl," crowed Gregory. "Some beau will find this lively spirit extremely charming in her one day. Believe me," he said. Vivian briefly frowned, and Gregory wondered why that might be. But then she gave him a reluctant smile. "One day. Well, no doubt you are right," she said with a sigh, before reaching over to gather the basket with her curtain fabric so that she could continue her sewing. She laid out the material and threaded her needle. "It's a strange thing," she said after a while, not looking at him. "You are close, and yet you refuse to come any closer. I sit with you in the evenings the way that I might sit with a neighbor or a relative. It is a strange thing." His breath caught in his throat. I haven't come any closer, and I never hold you because I feel unworthy, and because I fear that where intimacy might lead, I might not be able to follow," he told her awkwardly. She looked over at him. "I don't understand at all," she said. "Let go of what it is that you have always been holding back. All of our difficulties in the past, as I remember them, were caused by your withholding something. Have we learned nothing?" "Are you saying that I have caused all of our difficulties?" Gregory bristled defensively, unsure of where this conversation was leading, and not liking that. "No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that nothing was ever really amiss between us. It has been like running from shadows. Wouldn't you agree? Don't think where things might lead, and just let us be happy now," she said. He made no reply, uncertain of what to say that would satisfy her. The certain knowledge that he did want to come closer, much closer, was in itself not going to be helpful. He looked at her and tried not to feel so helpless or so needy of her. Under no circumstances could a gentleman just throw himself at a lady, after all, even if she asked him to. Being a gentleman was a hardship. There was no doubt about it. He sat up straighter and tried to transmute his discomfort into greater elegance of presence. "So will you tell me about something from your past today?" she asked after a while, still looking intently at her needle, as if being afraid to look up. Or perhaps she just did not want to prick her finger from lack of caution, because that generally cut the evening short. "Very well," he said. "Maybe just something small today, as I'm still warming up to the whole idea of sharing something with you about my past," he agreed, hoping that he could perhaps soothe her a bit with a story. "I was the middle of 3 children, as I can't remember if I've already told you. My older brother Jimmy was named from my father. Jimmy was 4 years older than me, and was the older brother that every younger brother tries to emulate. He was strong, athletic, brave, noble, and fine in every way. Then I came along, daydreamy, disobedient, and talking to myself. I think my father often asked my mother where they had gone wrong with me. My younger sister, Dorothy, was 2 years younger than I, and she was sweet and kind and even-tempered. So between those 2 childhood paragons, I stood out even more. Dorothy and I played together much more often than Jimmy and I did, although I always longed for him to come and spend more time with me." "What was it like, having siblings?" asked Vivian. "I always imagined that it would be like having automatic friends." "Sometimes it was like that," agreed Gregory, taking another sip of warm bourbon, and not minding too much that it lacked his preferred ice and soda. "At other times, however, there were conflicts. Jimmy and I were competitive with each other, particularly in the area of horseback riding, where I thought I actually stood a chance of beating him. We set up for a race along a field one afternoon, and something happened, and his horse shied, perhaps from a snake in the grass, as we neared the finish line. He was thrown from the horse and broke his arm. He did not blame me for it, and he really did not take it too badly. But our father flew into a rage when he heard what had happened. I was forbidden to ride for a time after that, which was the worst punishment that I could have imagined at that age." "That was the brother that went off to war, right?" she asked. Gregory hesitated, then nodded. How much had he said to her about all of this before? "How old were you then?" asked Vivian, again watching her needle carefully. Perhaps she thought he would feel less shy to speak of his past if she proceeded gently and without looking directly at him. He felt the supportive space that she was creating about him, and the way that she was drawing him out and listening to him, and he loved her for it. It is more difficult to speak of the past than you might ever imagine love, he thought. "I was 11, he answered her. "What were you like at 11? She asked gently. "I was rather awkward and shy," he admitted. "My headstrong disobedience had started to be tempered, and I had something new about which I was rapidly becoming very embarrassed." She looked up quickly, blushed in spite of herself, and then recovered and continued looking at her sewing. "And what was that?" she asked. "Well, I was getting to be unusually tall. I was growing so much and so fast, it was hopeless trying to keep me in pants that fit. Then I turned 12, and then 13, and by that point I was so tall that people stared wherever I went. I felt gawky and awkward, with both my face and my great height hanging out there and attracting attention, realizing within a few more years that I was the tallest person by far in any room, and wanting to shrink away into invisibility instead, Gregory said. Funny how real this sudden recollection of the past still felt. He couldn't remember things like on what date he was next expected at Wolf's place, but he could still feel exactly how his face had burned as he walked along the dirt road toward church on Sunday, walking beside his equally embarrassed mother, and knowing that everyone who walked or rode past them stared at them. "You're a tall man, there is no denying it," said Vivian, "but you do not look like a giant or anything like that. Personally, I think you look spectacular." She blushed again as her eyes sparkled up at him. "I'm flattered," he replied. "These days, I am still almost invariably the tallest man in any place where I happen to be, although mostly I no longer bang my head on light fixtures and door frames. I think they make the doors taller now or something. Back then, I was still trying to figure out how to manage this much elevation, and I think I must have had a permanent lump on my forehead from hitting everything. I cannot maybe convey to you exactly how bad it was, but perhaps it is telling that my mother began praying to God every Sunday for me to stop growing. My father just growled that this was another example of how everything was wrong with me. It was a dark time." "I thought 11 was a wonderful time," said Vivian. "Awfulness came when I turned 14, and Mother took me out of school. Overnight, my entire world shrank down to just my mother and Nadine, and Nadine's family. I suppose everyone has something that is a difficulty for them when growing up." "Yes, I suppose so," said Gregory, finishing his bourbon. They were silent for a while, and he hoped that he had given her enough to think on for one evening. "Well, let me know if you would like me to take Sophie into town one afternoon next week. I would be happy to do it," he finally said. He took his glass into the kitchen, and then Vivian walked him to the door, and they bade each other good night, and with a soft smile, she let him out. The following Thursday, Gregory was given the approval to take Sophie to the aquarium for the afternoon. The minor detail of having to get her to eat something for lunch, since she had refused to eat anything at Miss Carroll's, as Miss Carroll told him, caught him unawares, but he confidently marched her into the first cafe they passed and asked her to order herself lunch. It was inconvenient, not knowing how much to order for her, or what kinds of foods she should have, so he assumed she could give him good direction in this. It turned out to be a confidence in her that was misplaced. Sophie ordered enough food to cover the top of the small table they sat at, and while Gregory looked on, she consumed noodles and ice cream and cake. Gregory took it in stride, and when they then came out and Sophie staggered along beside him, her face green and clutching her stomach, he walked her into the nearest alley, calmly opened the lid of a trash can, picked her up, and held her long hair back out of her face while it all came back up. It was very disgusting, and he had to close off his nostrils as well as close his eyes. "Here, try this bun and this apple instead," he said once he had set her back down, and he handed her 2 of the items that he had stashed away in his suit pockets as they had left the cafe, feeling very proud of himself for his presence of mind to pack some things along for later. Within 10 minutes, Sophie had eaten the apple and the bun, and the roses had returned to her cheeks. They spent the afternoon walking through the New York Aquarium, where Sophie watched the fish, and Gregory watched Sophie, her small and eager face distorted by the glass of the fish tanks. Everything fascinated her, and they stayed until the museum was closing, and the museum employees threw them out. They returned home to find Vivian's mother in the apartment, agitated and frantic. "Mr. Morgan, Vivian told me that you and Sophie would be returning by 4 o'clock. It is now almost 6:30. I've been worried sick." Oh, this is not an auspicious beginning to my new job as a nursemaid, thought Gregory. He made his profuse apologies and explained about his bad memory, but otherwise everything had gone just fine, and they had had a most educational afternoon. And then Sophie spoiled everything by happily regaling her grandmother with the story of her noodles and desserts lunch feast, and how it had all come back up in the alley trash can. Madame Prevet's eyebrows rose in alarm. Then she sighed and said something about it being clear that Gregory had no experience with children, and that Vivian would have to give him some more detailed instructions for next time. Gregory exhaled with relief. At least it still sounded like there would be a next time. Childcare turned out to be a job, like any other, meaning that it was something one could get better at with additional practice. Vivian always packed Sophie a sandwich thereafter, so that put an end to the noodles and cake luncheon menu. Gregory and Sophie came to look forward to their Thursday afternoons, and that also brought Gregory into Vivian's apartment yet another day in the week, so that it began to feel ever more like a joint household. Vivian asked Gregory if he would help her in the kitchen after dinner, and he said gladly, but she would have to give him very detailed instructions, since he had never done kitchen work of any kind, either as a child or as a grown man. She shook her head in disbelief, but then calmly showed him how to dry dishes. And now in the evenings, after Sophie's dinner was over, if Vivian's mother was not about, as increasingly she seemed not to be now, something that made Gregory wonder, then he would come and stand at Vivian's right elbow, ready to take the wet, washed plates and utensils as she handed them to him. And he dried them, thinking that that was possibly the single most domestic activity that he had ever done. This washing and drying tradition has become a kind of almost unbearably sweet intimacy for me, and I savor each minute of it with intense relish, he later wrote in his journal. I wonder if you know this. I wonder how damned I am for feeling it. It is a good feeling, this playing house with you, and the happiness it gives me is hard to put into words. You are there, and we are so close in that moment, so connected. It is the perfect image to me of alignment with you. We are standing close together, working side by side on a shared task, perfect division of assignments between us, our hands working at a matched pace, so that you finish washing a piece of silverware as I finish drying the previous one. This sweet efficiency of work as well as of emotion. Every fork or spoon or knife or plate you hand me is you saying to me that you love me, and I accept it, and then rub the item until it is dry and shiny again. I stand there, holding the dish towel in one hand, and watch as each wet item passes one by one through your fingers, and I imagine that my hands could be your hands, that I could look through your eyes and see everything through them, as if it was your body that I was in. I don't have to worry or wonder at which fork or which plate you will not accept me anymore. You give me every fork and every plate as you finish with it. We see the job through to the end. My heart soars happily somewhere above your kitchen sink, and in that moment, I believe us to be in the very center of all of the happiness in the universe, and I cannot picture a greater delight. Vivian must have been thinking along similar lines, because she said with a smile, You know, I wanted to live with you like this, in your cottage, at the Mullins. "Oh no, this is much better," Gregory assured her. "That place was cold, drafty, and full of spiders." They both laughed. "Where will you take Sophie next week?" Vivian asked. "The park again? The Metropolitan Museum of Art?" Vivian had remarked endlessly on Gregory's having bought Sophie a box of colored pencils and an artist's sketch pad, and then having taken her to the art museum. It seemed as exotic to her as taking Sophie on a trek across the sand dunes of Arabia. "We'll probably go to the park," said Gregory. After the first 10 minutes with the colored pencils, it got difficult to keep her in one place. Sophie sees the galleries in terms of running space, not so much yet for what they contain. "I saw she had made some lovely colored scribbles in her sketch pad," said Vivian. "Well, actually, I made those, mostly," he said sheepishly. "I was trying to copy a landscape painting. You know of my old fascination with landscapes. Anyways, it is good to know that my creation was mistaken for the work of a 4-year-old. Gregory made a face, but then laughed, and Vivian laughed too. "It is good that you also write," she said, "because as a landscape artist I am not sure you would find adequate appreciation." She reached up a hand to consolingly pat the back of his shoulder. She had not asked him again about the past since their last conversation about it, and he wondered when she would bring the topic forward again. Probably she was waiting for him to speak of it, but he felt himself waiting for something too, although he did not know what it was. So they spoke of things that Sophie had done, or of Wolf and the store, or of Vivian's job, or her mother's life, and often they did not speak at all, but listened to music on the small radio that Vivian had in the living room. Vivian finished the curtains for the living room and began working on the ones for the bedrooms. Summer moved forward. True to her word, Vivian did not ever remark on it on days when his hands felt cold, and she never mentioned his non-eating, nor did she have any comments to make about his bourbon consumption. But his oddness about blood had a way of always inevitably coming to the forefront again. One weekend day, he came by in the afternoon, having called her on her new telephone line and confirmed that she was at home. He let himself in, and Sophie immediately raced into his shins in excitement. Unusually, she was wearing bathing gear. "Here, let me shut the door at least," he told her, reaching down to pick her up and lift her on his arm. She shouted happily, bringing Vivian into the living room. "Why is Sophie running through the rooms in her swimsuit?" he asked, setting her back down and watching her dash away again. "I have no idea," Vivian admitted with a laugh. "She dressed herself for once, so who am I to argue? I have been thinking, though, that maybe we could take Sophie to the beach at Coney Island. Would you come with us to something like that?" Even without really thinking, he replied, "Sure, but not today, right?" Then he realized what he was saying and blushed. Vivian drew in a breath and then blushed too. "Everything about me is known to you, down to my woman's private monthly health affairs? Oh, Gregory, couldn't you at least pretend that you don't know?" "I'm dreadfully sorry. I don't know what came over me. I can't help it. Still, I suppose it would help to spend the day outside today," he mumbled. "You always know?" she asked cautiously. "I always know," he sighed. "The park, then?" To flee from the awkwardness of the moment, he went to help Sophie put her shoes on. The next Thursday was warm, wonderful weather again, and Gregory picked Sophie up from her play circle and took her into the city, to Central Park. She ate her sandwich, and then they had the idea to ride the carousel, and then to visit the Central Park Zoo. The carousel ride went off perfectly, but then on the way to the zoo, the exceptionally fast and sure-footed Sophie caught her small shoe on a branch left lying across the path, and as if in slow motion. Gregory watched with horror as she fell. Gregory was fast, but somehow he was not fast enough to reach her before her small body, so near to the ground anyways, scraped against the pavement. Knowing next to nothing about small children, he had not considered how accident-prone they were, and he had certainly not considered how difficult the insignificant cuts and scrapes of childhood would be for someone like him. By the time he reached her, the first of her screams ripped through the air, and he could see the blood on her skinned palms and knees, even before he smelled it. Sophie looked up at him, and she must have seen the look of horror on his face, because she screamed even louder. He stood over her for a brief moment, and felt himself shaking. The sweet smell of her, so different from Vivian, but yet so very similar. And in an instant he was transported back to the moment, all those years ago, when he had huddled defensively against the side of a building as Vivian had lain bleeding onto the sidewalk after their collision. He must have had better self-control then, he thought, because now this moment was almost unbearable. What could he do now? He closed off his nostrils and bent down. Oh God, and tried to speak to her, but she kept screaming. At last he shouted at her to get her attention. "Sophie, listen to me," he said hoarsely. "Look at me. You will be all right. I have to go and get a policeman. He will take you home. Do you understand? You are to go with him. Don't move. Promise me. Don't move." Even if she did move, he knew that he could readily find her anywhere in the park, as long as the blood kept running down her shin. It was red and shiny, and snaking a quick path down the front of her leg, and it was hard not to look at it. Oh God! He felt himself choking, and turned his head away. An elderly lady was walking down the path toward them, and Gregory unsteadily went up to her. "Excuse me, madame, do you mind watching this child while I go find a policeman? She is alone, and now she has fallen. Thank you so very kindly." He did not wait for a reply. He merely turned around, took one more look at Sophie, and then fled. With every sprint that moved him further away from her, his agony eased, and his mind cleared. He had to find a policeman. Then he remembered that there was a police station in Central Park, not too far from where he was, so he turned to run there. People were staring as he ran, so he knew he had to be going way too fast, but he could not afford a second of delay. If anything happened to Sophie, if anyone took her or injured her, it would all be Gregory's fault. At last, he neared the historic police building, close to the lake. His mind raced. How would this work? He stopped by the door, pulled out his pocket notebook, and copied Sophie's name and Vivian's apartment address onto a fresh sheet, then tore it out, folded it up, and entered the station. "Good afternoon, sir," said the policeman at the nearest desk. "A child has fallen and injured herself in the park. I found this address in her pocket and assume this is her home. An elderly lady has stayed with her to keep her company. Could you send someone immediately to go and take her home? Some, bandages would be helpful as well," Gregory added. "A child, you say?" said another policeman, standing up and putting his policeman's hat on his head. He took the piece of paper from Gregory. "Which way?" "Follow me," said Gregory, leading the way out of the station. It was all he could do to patiently walk with the policeman, rather than pick up the slow man and run with him through the park. But the policeman appeared to be carrying a gun, and Gregory did not know how his own body would take to being shot at close range. He suspected that it would not go over too well, and so he bit back his impatience and led the way to the path where Sophie was. Time passed, perhaps 10 minutes. I must have run very, very fast, thought Gregory ruefully. At last they were close to where Sophie had fallen. The elderly lady was still with her, although Sophie had been moved onto the grass, where she was still crying loudly. "I cannot let her see me," thought Gregory, or she will tell everyone that she knows me." "The child is there," said Gregory to the policeman, and he pointed with his finger. "Ah, yes, I see," began the policeman, but Gregory did not hear the end of what he was going to say, because Gregory took a deep breath and moved with superhuman speed to vanish himself from the spot, as he could do in short bursts if the situation demanded. It was the closest trick that Gregory knew to being able to make himself invisible. Before the policeman turned his head again, Gregory was behind a tree, and then behind the next, and then behind the next. From his hiding place, Gregory saw the policeman walk over to Sophie, read to her from the piece of paper, see Sophie nodding her head while still crying loudly, and then the policeman picked her up in his arms and carried her toward the path, where a second policeman was coming. Gregory's eyes never once left her, until he saw Sophie safely on horseback and transported across the park to the park's edge, where a police car was waiting, and Sophie was piled in it. Gregory could not hope to race through New York's crowded sidewalks in the middle of the afternoon, so he reluctantly had to let the police car vanish into the city traffic. All he could do was pray that Sophie would arrive home safely and quickly, and that her grandmother would already be home. It was mercifully about that time. He caught a cab himself and rode out to Queens as well, and then as soon as he arrived, he hurried up to Vivian's apartment and rang the doorbell. Vivian's mother opened the door. "Is Sophie back home?" he blurted out, skipping all preamble. "Yes, she is. 2 New York City policemen just escorted her home. What is the meaning of this, Mr. Morgan?" cried Madame Pravette. "I arranged for the policeman to take her," said Gregory, stepping into the apartment. "She fell in the park and injured herself, and I could not take her home, but I have done all I could to ensure her safety and her well-being." "You left an injured child sitting in the middle of a path in Central Park?" cried Madame Pravette accusingly. "Who would do such a thing?" "Someone who cannot bear the smell of blood, madame, as I believe you already know about me," said Gregory simply. He was not about to mince words with this woman who had treated him in the past either politely or coldly, depending upon what was expedient to her at the time, and who was now living in an apartment that his largesse had made possible for her to live in alone. "Now, if you will excuse me, I need to see Sophie." "This strange phobia has gone on too long, and you have indulged it too much. You do not think you have further explanations to make, Mr. Morgan?" cried Madame Pravette with disbelief. "I think any further explanations would be due to Sophie's mother," said Gregory, throwing his hat into the living room, and then going down the hall to Sophie's bedroom. He could hear her crying inside, and he gently knocked on the door. There was no answer from her, so he walked in. Vivian's mother had followed him, but remained standing in the hallway. "Sophie," he said, sitting down on the edge of her bed. Her hands and her knees were taped up with bandages. "Sophie, it's all right. I'm so sorry." "Why did you leave?" she asked him, her face red-eyed and tear-streaked. Oh, the number of times he had seen her mother like this, he thought. "I told you I had to go and get a policeman to help us. Don't you remember?" he asked her, gently petting the top of her head. "Why?" she asked. "Because you needed bandages and I did not have any," he said. "I saw you got a horseback ride out of it all," he added. Sophie smiled a tear-stained smile. "Did you see Goey-Goey?" "Yes, I did. I followed you all the way until they put you in the police car at the edge of the park," he told her. "You did?" she asked him. "Of course. Do you think that I would leave you?" "But 3 of us would not have fit on that horse, so I ran behind," he said. "I did not see you," she said. "No, I went through the woods, you know, shadier in the summer for those of us who have to walk," he explained. "How was the horse ride?" "I was so high up," she exclaimed excitedly. "Ah, my future young horsewoman," he thought proudly. For a brief instant, he imagined moving them all back to Tonne-Désirée, and living in the large house, and filling the stable with horses for Sophie to ride. But then he remembered that the house was gone, and the horses were all sold. Ah, well. Well, rest in your bed, and your mother will be home soon, he said. I have to go now. He embraced her quickly and walked out. You stayed with her the entire time? Vivian's mother asked him. No, not the entire time. I had to run and get the policeman, so I left her in the care of a kindly-looking elderly lady for a few minutes. But I assure you, no man has ever run faster than I did to that police station. Do you imagine me to be somehow reckless? I would give my life for this child, he said to her. Madame Pravette gave him a long, strange look. Do you even have a life to give, Mr. Morgan? She asked quietly. His blood ran cold, colder than usual. I do not know to what you are alluding, madame, but it sounds offensive, he said quickly, grabbing his hat from the coffee table where he had tossed it earlier. I'm glad Sophie is safe and well. Good day to you. And he was out of the apartment and out of the building before she could say another word. He spent the rest of the daylight hours wandering around Queens, waiting for the hour when Sophie would be in bed and Vivian's mother might go home and Vivian would be alone, so that he could go back up and talk to her. For the first time in a very, very long time, he dreaded going to see Vivian. He felt guilty, not for what he had done, but for what he could not do. An ordinary father, taking his daughter out for a stroll in the park, would never have done what Gregory had had to do that afternoon. Between this guilt and hearing Wolf's voice over and over in his head, as if a needle had gotten stuck on his gramophone, saying that it was too dangerous to be in the presence of a small child, he soon started to feel much less confident than when he had spoken to, or was it really quarreled with, Vivian's mother. Well, our Thursday afternoons together are surely done, he thought grimly. It filled him with further misery, because he had come to love having small, blonde-haired Sophie bouncing along beside him, carrying her when she tired, picking her up to see things in museums or at the zoo, and just having a playful companion who always looked up to him and up at him with eyes full of admiration. Everywhere they had gone, people looked at them, this strange pair, the tall, dark-haired, handsome man and the small, golden-haired child. Now, one misstep later, and it was all gone. And even if he could continue to take Sophie about town, would this new worry not always now be at the back of his mind, that something similar could happen again? What if Vivian was angry with him? What if she sent him away and never forgave him? By 9 o'clock he had wandered the streets of Queens for so long that he had been able to come up with at least 1,000,000 terrible possible outcomes of this single afternoon, and burdened by all this fear and guilt, he turned his feet back in the direction of her apartment, walked up the stairs, and tapped his knuckles lightly against the door. Vivian immediately opened it. "Oh, Gregory," she sighed, and she put her arms about his neck, bringing her cheek to his shoulder. "Come in," she then added, straightening back up and moving away from him to go sit on her small armchair. He walked in, shut the door, and slid the brim of his hat nervously through his fingers as he walked to the sofa and sat down. "Vivi," he said, looking into her face, "forgive me. I'm incredibly sorry. Your mother told you what happened?" "She did. She also went on to tell me her insane theories on why you are the way you are, and she finished up by recommending that I stop being friends with you and start coming to church with her again on Sundays and pray for my soul." Vivian gave another sigh. "You don't go to church on Sundays anymore?" asked Gregory, his curiosity briefly diverted by this new information. "I didn't know that." "Well, why not?" She shrugged. "Chip was a total heathen, in addition to being a total louse and a criminal, so we never went to church in those years. And then my mother moved here and said I should start going again, but I realized that I hadn't gone in years and did not miss it. Sophie screaming in the pews has been another deterrent, and as hard as I work, I confess I would rather take 2 mornings a week off to get some rest," said Vivian. "What did your mother say about me?" asked Gregory cautiously, wanting to know how bad it was, but yet hoping not to have to hear the details of any specific accusations. "She said—" "Oh, I'm not going to sit here and repeat the daft, superstitious nonsense that she said. If anyone is going to try to tell me that we need an exorcism here and that you're not a good man, then I'm not willing to even give that a moment's consideration. I know you, Gregory Morgan, and I've known you for years, and I don't know exactly what is wrong with you, although it is undeniable that something is wrong with you, how you never change and all of that. But despite that, behind all of that, you are the kindest, most generous man and loyal friend that I have ever had," she said. "Even more loyal of a friend than Nadine?" he asked, smiling to show her that he was attempting to make a light jest. "Even more than Nadine," she replied earnestly. "No one has ever been as good to me as you have, and my entire life would be entirely different today if you had not come into it." He felt a lump rise into his throat. "You are incredibly kind to say so," he told her. And then he explained in detail what had happened in the park that afternoon. "It is clear that we will have to do something about this," said Vivian as she stood up, her brow furrowed with concern. I should go away forever?" asked Gregory fearfully and with shame. "Go away? What nonsense! No, you will just have to carry adhesive bandages about with you. What is it with you and the melodramatic suggestions?" replied Vivian. "Come into the kitchen with me." He followed her into the kitchen, where she opened the door of the cabinet under the sink and pulled out a box that read Band-Aid on it in large red letters. "What is this?" he asked. "It is a bandage and adhesive all in one," she said. "It is easy. Here, we will do this together." It was not until she had the kitchen knife in her hand that he saw what she meant to do. "No, Vivi, I don't think—" he began, but she ignored him. In one fast movement, she had made a small puncture in the pad of one of the fingers on her left hand with the tip of the knife, and a droplet of blood began gathering like a small scarlet bead where the skin had been broken. I can't... It doesn't bother you?" "I'm a seamstress. Do you know how many times I've pricked my fingers? Gregory, don't look at it. Focus over here. Hold your breath. Do what you need to do. You can do this. The packaging opens at this end, over here, and then you pull these off so the adhesive is exposed. Now the goal is not to get the adhesive on the wound, but this part, the bandage. All right, now attach it here, and pull it over there, like that. Yes, very good. That is it. That is all. Exhale again," she told him. He was shaking, he could see, but he had managed. Underneath the bandage, he thought he could still feel the movement of the blood coming out of the wound, but he could not smell it very much anymore. Instead, he smelled something else, something like chemicals. "What is that smell?" he asked. "The material or some kind of sterilization chemical that they use on the bandage, I'd guess," said Vivian. "And don't tell me that you can still smell any blood. This is nothing compared to days when I should not go to the beach at Coney Island." Gregory blushed, but then cautiously sniffed again. "You're right. I could manage this," he finally said. "Fine. Then here are 10 of them, and off you go," she told him, handing him the handful of bandages and walking him back out to the living room. Am I still allowed to take Sophie out on Thursday afternoons, then?" he asked with surprise. "Of course. I don't see why not. The key is to not look directly at the wound and to be quick about the whole thing and get the injury covered. If it requires stitches, then go for help. Call a policeman again. I understand. I think you handled it admirably. Gregory, I trust you." She embraced him again. "Oh, Vivi," he said thankfully. "You have no idea how afraid I was that you would send me away, that you'd send me to hell." "No plans to send anyone to hell right now," she said calmly. "Now go home and get some rest. It has been a trying day." There was no arguing with that, and so he got his hat and went. A few weeks later, when calm had returned, and the scabs had fallen off of Sophie's knees, and her accident had become a harmless thing of the past, Gregory came by one evening to pay them a visit. These days, if Vivian's mother was ever there, she beat a hasty retreat back down to her own apartment as soon as Gregory arrived, an arrangement with which Gregory was entirely satisfied. He helped feed Sophie her dinner, helped Vivian clean up afterward while Sophie fed General Beauregard his bunny dinner, and then he got Sophie into bed where, this time, she insisted that he tell her a story. A story. Well, my principessa, I know one about a Princess Sophie, he told her. "Oh, do you really?" she cried. "Tell that one." Well, once upon a time, a long time ago, there lived a Princess Sophie. She was very, very beautiful, and she was married to a young man who was soon to become the emperor of a large kingdom. He was never going to make a great ruler, anyone could see that, but Princess Sophie was not only beautiful, but also very wise. "What is wise?" asked Sophie. "It means smart. She had a fast mind. She could think of many, many good ideas." Her friends helped her to become the ruler instead of her husband, and she became one of the greatest queens that Europe has ever seen. How many women have been in charge of an entire empire? Not many, but she was that good, said Gregory. She became one of the most famous women of all time. Vivian had finished in the kitchen and had come to stand in the doorway to listen to them. "That's not a true story, is it?" she asked. "If what you say is true, I would have heard of her." "Would I tell an untruth?" asked Gregory, turning to look at Vivian. "She changed her name to Catherine, and then history added, the Great. And you will be just as amazing, my little one," he said, kissing Sophie's forehead and giving her a hug. "Now go to sleep." He turned out the lights, and they walked with Vivian back to the living room, where she stopped in the doorway to the kitchen and leaned her back against the doorframe. "Catherine the Great was called Sophie?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "And her unofficial co-regent for many years was a man that she deeply cared for, her lover, who, by the way, was called Grigory. Actually, make that 2. She had 2 lovers named Grigory. I assure you, it's all true." A pained look came over Vivian's face. She said nothing for a while, and then she said, "You care for Sophie very much. I know. I can see that." "I love her. She is every wonderful thing, all in this small and perfect package," he replied, stepping closer to Vivian. "She will grow up, you know," said Vivian. "Will you like that, I wonder? Or will you wish that she had stayed a child? I think you find grown women rather more difficult to deal with directly. Why is it, do you think, that you love her?" Probably because I love her mother," he said in a low voice, surprising himself that he had said it, and he looked down into Vivian's eyes so that she could see the truth of it, right there in his soul. His words must have surprised her also, because she was speechless. He crossed the last step between them, and suddenly it seemed incredible to him that he had known her for all of this time, for years in fact, and yet had never kissed her, at least not when she was awake and aware of it. "Vivian," he began hoarsely, "may I—" "Don't ask," she gasped. At first he thought she meant for him to withdraw his request, but then he looked more closely at her eyes. They were half closed, and their expression was smoky and wanton. "Don't ask, just do it," her eyes said, and then he realized that, unlike people that he may have ever dazzled in the street, this creature genuinely and fearlessly wanted him, and wanted him to have her, and it thrilled him. Mesmerized, he caught the back of her head with his hand, saw the surprise and approval grow further in her eyes, and then a sound like a low growl escaped from his lips, a sound he had only rarely heard himself utter. It had an immediate effect on Vivian, like an electric current suddenly going through her, and her whole body arched as he took her lips with his. Her lips were soft and warm and yielding, and he thought he could feel the blood moving through them, and then he thought he might die of the glory of it. Who knew two people could be as connected as this, he thought. And then the thought was its own aphrodisiac. His mouth moved against hers as if it knew exactly what to do, even though he had not kissed anyone like this in so long that he could not even remember when that might have been. Her arms rose up feebly to come around his neck, but there was no strength in them. All of her life force was pouring into their kiss. The kiss went on, and he was suddenly grateful for the door frame to help support her body as he pinned her against it, since on her own she might have slid down along it in a near faint. He felt the thinness of her skin, and behind it, an incredible amount of movement inside the walls of her mouth, like a rushing river inside of her, and soon it was sweeping him along. How could he resist this? No one could resist this. And then suddenly, he fell into her and vanished, and in that instant, all temptation ceased. Everything shattered. Their kiss was like an explosion, and then as it went on, it changed to become an exploration into a great depth. And here they were connected, and there, at that level, they were also connected, and no matter how long the kiss went, or how much depth they seemed to traverse, the connection was just as powerful. There was no end to it. there was no point in which they were not in fact one and the same. He pulled his mouth away, and they both gasped for air. Somehow he had hit the light switch on the kitchen wall with his hand when he had put his arms out to push her back against the door frame, and they stood in the dark, panting. "Gregory," she whispered, her voice all raw vulnerability, reminding him immediately of the first time she had spoken his name like this in her mother's apartment back in Louisiana. He asked, his head bowed once more, and lightly planting kisses on her shoulder now, through her blouse. "If you had only ever kissed me like this before, like I always wanted, I would never have married another. Never. I swear it," she breathed. "I never would have left you, and you would have stayed with me. Yes, always," he whispered back. Then he brought his lips back to hers and kissed her again, and it seemed as if they just continued where they had left off. Their kiss expanded until it filled the entire room, and the emotion of it rang out like a bell. This time Vivian ended it, bringing her hands up to his face and gently moving him away. "Gregory," she whispered, "I'm afraid. It is almost like, after a few moments like this, I don't know anymore which one of us I am." At first, he did not know what she meant, but then he paused, took his bearings, and realized that he felt it too. It was like standing at the edge of a deep chasm and truly seeing into its depths for the first time. Everything seemed extremely fragile and tender, almost sore, as if the earth might break under their footsteps if they now moved. He touched the light switch, and the kitchen filled with light. "Come, let's sit on the sofa," he said gently, picking her up in his arms. In the living room, he set her down, tenderly removing her shoes. He turned on the smallest lamp, and then gingerly sat down beside her, from where they both stared into the empty space in front of them. After all of their exhausted roaming, after all of this time, they had at last reached each other's shores and discovered that the landscape there was unmistakably like their own, as if all of their indescribable similarity was suddenly made visible, and the expansive horizons of this foreign land were wild, vast, and endless. "I used to dream about something like this," he said softly. "I used to dream about feeling like this with someone else. Do you have any idea how rare a thing it is in this world? I've never been to this place before," she said slowly. "It feels holy, like church." "I haven't been here before either," he admitted, feeling his heart pounding in time to hers. "What shall we do?" she asked. "Just be in it, I think," he replied. And so then they sat wide-eyed and in silence for a long, long time, listening to each other's breathing and to each other's hearts beating, until at last she leaned over and fell asleep in his arms. With great reluctance, He let her go, and she stretched out on the sofa, where he covered her lightly with a blanket, before kissing her forehead, grabbing his hat, and letting himself out, stepping into a world that had completely changed.